Hello and welcome to the second tutorial in this series on bridging C# to Java. Again, my intent for this is for people who are familiar with doing development work with Visual Studio and C# to kind of give you a springboard into developing an application using Java. This tutorial is going to deal with doing an initial project setup using Maven and to get it imported into Eclipse. So what I have queued up here is the command needed to generate a simple hello world project. We're going to use Maven to do this, and so there's several ways you can do it. Project setup. More than likely, if you already have other projects set up that use Maven, grab one of those, copy them over, and make changes to the build file. But in this case, because we don't actually have anything set up yet, we're going to use it to, in this case, we're going to tell Maven we want to generate a project with a group ID of my first app, and then an artifact ID of Spring Starter. And so what this is going to do is it's going to run through the Maven build process, and it's going to say, hey, wait a minute, we need to run in interactive mode. And so it defaults right here. This ID value is the ID for the simple hello world project, and then the latest version is version 1.1, and then we want for our build, we want this when we build, we want it to be version 1.0 snapshot. Okay, and so then it just has you confirm, and then if we bring up a directory, we'll see now we have Spring Starter. Okay, so now that we have the project generated, just wanted to say a few more words about what this archetype is used for. And so you'll notice that it's asking me for some questions when I generated this. So what I had to generate is a simple hello world project with a simple unit test. So that's not the only one available. It's the default if you don't enter anything. But it's also possible to bring up other archetypes, from creating web services to GUI applications to, I'm pretty sure if you look, there's probably some even doing Android applications. So now that we have Maven generating the project for us, next step is let's get this into Eclipse. So to do that, fire up Eclipse, you can go to File, Import, and it's going to ask you for import source. And so because this is a Maven project, let's open that up, and you want to select existing Maven project. Okay. Now the next step, it's going to ask you for a root directory. In this case, we have this generate in the source folder. And then what it's going to do is scan through that directory and look for every single possible project that can be found under it. And so in this case, here's our project, which we now want to finish. And so now this shows up in our package explorer. And let's go ahead and expand this. And so here, you'll see our generated hello world application, very, very simple. And then this is our JUnit testing, which I'm actually going to be getting rid of that because I'm going to be using a different version of JUnit that's slightly more up to date. So the other important file that we're going to want to take a look at is this POM. So this is the project file, or the Maven project file, and this contains all of the metadata describing how to build the project and how to identify it, what version to use. And so if you're familiar with MS Build in the CSproj file, this is kind of the analogous file. The other thing, and so this is actually a very, very simple POM file. There's once you start digging into it, it's possible to tell Maven to start out by go download a WSDL off the web, generate the boilerplate code, and use that code for interacting with a web service, then run a bunch of unit tests against that code, and then deploy it to some archive server, and then you name it, it's pretty much, people describe this as the kitchen sink of build systems. So in this situation, it's just a very simple project, and the main thing, and it just has the main nuts and bolts needed to build it, which is It needs to have a group ID, artifact ID, and a version. It needs to know what is it building, and finally, what other third-party dependencies does it need to incorporate. Okay, so a little bit about the dependencies. If we switch over, and so if you take a look in your profile, there should be once you get something set up, you should have this M2 folder with a folder called repository. And so the way this works is when you put in a dependency, it's going to take a look in this folder and see, do we actually have the particular dependency in place? If not, then go to an archive server and download it. And so just to demonstrate, we're going to change this version to 4.10, which is a slightly upgraded version of JUnit. And you'll notice it built, and so it didn't have the proper version. It contacted, in this case, the Maven Apache archives, and it downloaded the necessary files in order to build this application. Okay, so what we're going to do is I have another set of dependencies that we're going to put in. And so in this case, this is going to add a dependency on JUnit, in this case version 4.11, which based off of looking is the latest version of JUnit, our unit test framework. The next piece is going to be log4j, which is the Apache logging system for Java. And then finally, the core elements needed to enable the Spring framework on this application. So in this case, what this is going to be doing is this is going to be giving us the logic needed to run a unit test. The log4j is going to provide a more effective logging framework that is a lot more robust. And then the Spring framework is going to be used, in this case, we're going to be using the XML bean file, which I'll get to here in a minute, to handle configuration. So now that we have these dependencies in, if we take a look, you'll notice, so JUnit, and this is going to actually pull in a whole bunch of other files. And so in this case, JUnit actually has a dependency on this handcrest library. Same thing, the Spring core has some other dependencies that Maven handles for us so that we don't actually have, like I said, it just downloads it and you're done. So next step we want to do is I want to get the unit test framework set up on this. And so I do have kind of an approach. It's something I just have developed over the years. And so we're going to create a new package, and then in here, a new class that I'm going to call Integration Base. Okay, in this, we take a look, and so this I kind of cheated and added in, and I already had some of the code ready to go. So what we want to do, so this logger is the log4j framework, and so we're going to go ahead and incorporate this in. And so the whole idea is integration base contains all of my log calls and logging methods, and it will also at some point contain the calls I want to make if I want to make an assertion and to do a test assertion. Okay, next thing I want to do is add into this is a second class called testBase. In this case, what we want to have it do is derive or extend the integration base. And what will happen is pretty much any sort of helper class or test code, any sort of helper class I usually try and have derived from integration base, and then any test cases I have derived from test base. Okay, so now what we're going to do is add in a new package, and actually so that we get the namespacing. Let's call this test cases. New class. Okay, so now that we have, in this case, so test cases, you'll notice extends test space, which then in turn extends integration base. Okay, so now what we're going to do is, so this is one of the reasons why I'm using the updated version of JUnit, because it does the identification of test cases via annotations, and it's a lot cleaner interface. Okay, so now that we have our test case set up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just put a simple logging call. Let's go ahead and save this and run it. And so you'll see it's going to run and execute the test case. The logging, you'll see, shows up. And so we have, in this case, it's an info call. And it identifies, in this case, the namespace, or the package name is test cases, class name of test case, and then the logging statement. So now that we have this, let's go ahead and get some configuration files set up on this. Okay, so now that we want to get some config settings in, we're going to use Spring to handle this for us. And so I'm going to pull in some code that I had already written. And so this first thing is the application context. And so this context object is something that will, in this case, it's going to go through and it's going to, on instantiation or on first reference, it's going to look for a file called config.xml. And let's go ahead and get the import set up on that. It's going to load that config.xml, and then based off of the entries in that, it'll present the objects that get defined in this config file. And so there's actually, like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of other tutorials on how these are set up that go into a lot more detail and do a lot better description. But for the sake of this demo, we're just going to do some real basic. So next thing we need to do is to get the config file. And we want this actually to be part of our, because we're actually doing stuff with our test cases. And I already have a config set up. And so a little bit about this. And so this is basically what they call a bean definition file. And so this is pretty much just boilerplate. You're just going to want to find a project that's got these namespaces and copy and paste them. The next piece is all the various beans that we want to have defined. And so for those of you who aren't aware, a bean is just basically a designation that Java uses to define various entities that can be injected or have various properties exposed. And so in this case, what we're saying is we want to create a bean with an ID of config entry. And the type of this bean is going to be a string. And the way that we want to construct it is to present a constructor arg of my value. You know, it's basically a very verbose way of saying, essentially, doing that using a descriptor language. And then what will happen is Spring will take this config file, read through this, and it'll use what's known as dependency injection to construct these objects and these entities. Now the nice thing is you're not just limited to strings. There's pretty much, the sky's the limit on what you can construct with these. So now that we have this config, so what it's going to say is, okay, when we get this, check to see is this thing null. If it is, then go ahead and construct it using these definitions and then pass it off to the whoever's calling. And so I already have some code ready. And so in this case, so what I want to do is I want to get this bean called config entry, and then unfortunately it's unable to dynamically, we need to tell it what sort of object you need to cast to. And so let's see exactly what this does. And so you'll see where, okay, you'll see there's a whole bunch of logging now where it's mentioning about the Spring framework. So we're running the test cases and setting up, now the Spring is with this call right here. Spring then has to do a bunch of setup and boilerplate setup, and then now it's getting the bean, and the bean has my value. Okay, so we change that. So now we have my new value. Okay, so, and then just to also demonstrate the reason for doing this and for using Maven and going with the command line as well. And so you'll notice a build failure, and that's because no goals. And so what we want to do is, now we were using the Eclipse IDE to build this. Now I want to just also demonstrate exactly what this does during with a command line. And so what I want to do is build this, and then I want to run the integration tests, which is going to build the code and then run through. And it's going to pick up any unit tests, and it's going to run them. And so you'll notice, again, so my test cases, there, it's picking up the file, or it's picking up that bean value. So at this point, I think this is about do it for this particular tutorial. Hope you enjoyed, and hopefully it wasn't too boring.